Hi guys, this is section 3, creating user interface with code. This is useful when types of inputs and numbers of inputs vary depending on other inputs. All right, so this is a case of this is the former, the different types of inputs depending on inputs from the user, other inputs from the user, right? So this particular case, let me zoom in for you guys here. So the author of our textbook has two inputs at the top, a label and the text input, the label, and select input, the type. But I don't really think that the text input is necessary here. So let's just focus on the select input, the second one, the type. So there are two choices, a slider or numeric. So if the user selects a slider, then we would have this slider input, right? But the user selects numeric, and then we would have numeric input, right? So this is a very simple example where, um, we have different inputs, different types of inputs depending on other inputs, right? So if you look at the code on the left, the big idea here is UI output in the UI, okay? UI output, that's a new function. And then on the server side, we have render UI. Okay, so that's a pair, UI output and render UI. Okay, and inside we have if else statement, right? Depending on the choice the user makes between slider and else, which is numeric in this case, right? So if the user chooses slider, then the slider input shows up, right? Um, so the dynamic, so dynamic. Um, okay, so dynamic that's input ID, and then we would have label, and then the label is whatever the text that user types in into this text box, right? And initial value 0, minimum value 0, maximum value 10, right? All right, so let's do this in our studio. All right, so let's first create the file. This will be section, let's call it 3.0, okay? And select all, delete, shiny app, right? So we click Files tab. Okay, we have 3.0. Now, again, we have the text input and then select input, right? So text input. So here we have input ID. What do we call it? Label, and also label for the label. And then select input. So select input, input ID, label, choices. Those are the mandatory arguments. So for select input, type. Okay, type, and also type for the label. And for choices, we want slider and numeric, right? And what is it? UI output, right? UI output. That's the new function we're learning in this section. UI output and the input ID numeric, right? So here output and then numeric should be the output, right? No, hold on. It's not output. Um, hold on. Yes, it is output. So yeah, I got confused briefly, right? Because we're dealing with input, right? These are all inputs, but um, we're calling it output, even though what we're creating here is still input, right? So that's something that you want to pay attention to, right? Yeah, it's even though it's output that we're creating on the app, we're calling it output. So UI output. Um, so output ID is numeric, and output dollar sign that output ID, which is numeric. Okay. So and then again, the new function here is render UI, right? So render UI, we have expression. So expression is what we have here, the if else statement, right? And then we want to put it in curly bracket because we're talking more than one line here. So if statement, right? So if, and then there will be condition, and then do something, and then else, and then do something, right? So within the parentheses, we need the condition, and the condition is input, which is this type, right? Type, equals slider, right? We have slider or numeric. Then do this, right? Else, else do this, right? Because we only have two choices. This works. So do this if slider, then we would have uh, slider input, right? The slider input, input ID, label, minimum, maximum value. We have five mandatory arguments. All right. So input ID, what do you want to put? Dynamic. Okay. The other thing here, the other thing that's unusual that I just noticed is the two, depending on the user's output, user's choice here for the type, slider numeric, we have two possible input, right? Slider input, numeric input. Their input ID is the same, right? Usually, um, the input function we have, they should have unique ID, right? But in this case, render UI, we have two input functions. They both have the same ID, right? Okay, so that's a distinction um, from the usual case, right? That's something new in this creating UI in render UI function. Okay, so the ID here is dynamic, and then the label is this label here. Okay, input $ label, and then we should have um, minimum, maximum, and value. But so value 0, minimum 0, and max 10. Okay, it doesn't really matter, but let's do it the way the author did in the textbook example, max 10. And then here, numeric input ID label value, minimum and maximum. They're not mandatory arguments, minimum, maximum, but just to be consistent with the slider input, let's provide value but the same value. Okay, so here again, same ID, and then input label. It's basically the same as the others. So value 0, minimum 0, max 10. And I wonder whether these should be the same. Well, I don't think that is the case. What I mean is these values uh, that we assign to value minimum maximum, should they be equal between slider input and numeric input? I don't think that's the case, but I mean, we can check it out, right? So run at, all right, so initial value 0, minimum 0, maximum 10. That's a slider input. Now, if we choose numeric, initial value 0, minimum, yeah, doesn't go below 0, so its minimum is also 0. Doesn't go up higher than 10, so maximum is 10, right? So, I mean, if we were to change this to 5, for example, does it work? So numeric input, yep, so it doesn't have to be the same. And whatever we type here, um, it shows up here as a label, right? The other thing the author talks about is um, what the value that we chose here. So let's say uh, 5 is not retained when we change the type, right, back to 0. If we want to retain the current value, right, then there is a function that we can use, and that is isolate dynamic, input dynamic. So the dynamic here again is the input ID for these functions, input controls here, right? And we're isolating it and save it value and provide that value to the value argument here. So instead of 0, we put value in there. Again, this value on the left of equal sign is not the same as value on the right side, right? The value on the left is the argument. The the value on the right is this value here that contains the current value, right? The user chose. Okay. All right. So let's do that. So we're going to put label here to retain the current value. We're going to create this value object, and we're going to use isolate function input dynamic, right? and we're going to provide that to the value argument. That okay, and then let's close this out and then run it again. Right. So the problem I noticed here is error slider input minimum, maximum, and value cannot be null. So this refers to value argument here apparently, right? Because minimum and maximum, they the app is initialized to 0 and 10, but when the app launches, it is null. We don't have a value for the value here, right? Um, until user chooses a value here. So for example, if you select numeric and then select a value 5 and then switch to slider, then it works because this value here is taking the current value user chose, which is 5 in the numeric type earlier, right? So that's that. Um, if you don't want to see this um, this error message when the app starts, one trick is instead of starting, because it's starting with the first option in the choices, right? So instead of that, you can maybe switch the slider, switch the order. So on load, it starts to numeric type, and then there's no error because um, because the numeric input. So here, let's check. Right. So let's bring up the documentation. Numeric input. So numeric input also has value. Ah, all right. So I'm not sure why. Okay. Okay. So numeric input also requires value. So in other words, it's mandatory. It so initial value. Um, all right. So what if no? So let's try this without um, retaining the current value, that functionality without that. So if we were to uh, start the app with null, so it appears um, numeric input doesn't mind to have null for the value argument. Okay, so when onload app initializes to null for the value argument, that's fine with the numeric input. But same is not true. So let's say so same is not true for slider input. Okay, slider input you can have null for the value argument. Okay, for no apparent reason that I'm aware of. So if you don't like this, again, um, when we are doing this, when we have this um, functionality to retain the current value, right? So we have this value object. Then you might want to switch the order like this, right? So it doesn't start with an error, right? So you select, and then when you switch to slider, it keeps or retain that current value, right? However, However, so it starts to initializes to numeric type, but then the user doesn't select a value and then switches the type. Then again, it because there's no current value, um, this value object takes null and it's completely dead. All right. So there's that issue. But the point of this exercise here is isolate function. We can use it to retain the current value. All right. Okay. I'll see you in the next video.